All right. My name is Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined for the severanth time by Matthew Vernon Whalan. How are you doing, Matthew?
Doing all right, man. Doing all right. Working hard. How you doing?
I'm all right. Just tried to finish, finish writing something real quick before this, which is part of the reason I'm doing this from home today. But yeah, I'm pretty good. So this is going to be interesting to watch. So this is a debate between Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who, of course, I'm sure people are aware is a independent presidential candidate. He was originally a Democratic primary candidate, and then he decided to run independently. There's actually some talk at one point that he might try to get like the Libertarian Party's ballot line. I don't know if that's actually something he would actually want to pursue. It'd be kind of a weird fit in any case, because I think a lot of libertarians did like him early on because of some of his positions on COVID and like his obviously RFK Jr., people are aware, is sort of prone to conspiracism about that, and certainly very hostile to all the sort of measures that were taken to try to stop it, and try to encourage people to get vaccinated, all that. And also because of something I actually agree with him on, right, which is his support for de-escalation and diplomacy in Ukraine. But there are a lot of other areas where it'd be a very weird fit, because he was actually an environmental lawyer for a long time. He does support a lot of things that are probably good, right, as far as like environmental regulation and all that, although he's made some weird comments on that in the campaign, but historically he certainly has. But then like where this really comes out is that he has this awful position on Israel Palestine. Like he's he is even though, right, he has a history of floating at least mildly anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in certain cases. He said that COVID might be a bioweapon that was engineered to like not hurt Chinese people or Ashkenazi Jews. He's also very, very Zionist, right? Very, very pro, whatever Israel does to the Palestinians, and has been, very consistently held that position. Whereas at least some libertarians have been good on that. Not all of them. If you read like Reason magazine, people like that, like I think a lot of your sort of moderate libertarians are actually kind of shitty on it. But a lot of hardcore libertarians are actually consistent enough about their stated principles that they're against like a state massacring huge numbers of civilians and displacing them from their homes and all that stuff. And so the guy he's debating here is Dave Smith, who, for anybody who's not familiar with him, he's a libertarian comedian, but at this point probably much better known as a podcaster. He hosts a show called Part of the Problem, and he's like he's very active in the Libertarian Party, and I debated him twice, right, in 2019. Like I think I've been like on his show 3 times. One of them was to talk about one of my books when it was coming out. One of them was to debate Gene Epstein, and one of them was to debate him. And he also came on my show to do that once. So I've debated Dave twice, and I very like thoroughly and extremely disagree with him on like, I don't know, 97% of everything, right? I mean, I mean, he's a really extreme libertarian, right? Like if he had his way, like even the road to the sidewalks would be privatized. But so that's obviously like very opposed to the core, right, of what my politics are about. But I've got to say, over the years that I've known him, I do kind of like the guy, and part of that's because I actually think he is like a lot of libertarians, like they'll sort of say good stuff about some subjects. It's like, oh yeah, we shouldn't be fighting all these wars, or like I don't know, we should you know mass incarceration is bad or whatever, right? Like they say good stuff about some subjects, but you could tell that like their heart really isn't into that. Like what they actually get excited about is like what the top marginal tax rate is.
Right.
So what I've always liked and respected about Dave, I guess, is that he's never struck me that way. It actually seems like he does get really mad about a lot of the things that, like, the reason he's getting mad about them has, like, his reason for objecting to them ultimately has to do with like libertarian principles, but like things that are actually important and bad. Like, like like way back in 2019, when very few people, it seemed like we're talking about this that much, right? Like, he was like constantly talking about how bad like the U.S. involvement in like the Saudi campaign in Yemen was, stuff like that, right? So my general expectation going into this is it's like, I mean, he's a libertarian. I'm sure he'll say a few things I disagree with, over the course of it, but since he is generally good on sort of caring about human rights in Palestine, and RFK is like kind of a disaster. Well, not kind of. RFK is a disaster on those topics, right? So that definitely informs what I'm expecting out of this.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I wasn't super aware of Dave Smith. I think I had seen him a couple places, maybe on your show as well. But
Yeah, he's been a Rogan a bunch of times. You might have seen him there, but anyway, I don't know. Like
yeah,
at least clips going around,
yeah, and the following behind RFK, from what I can tell, is kind of just like, there's a lot of different political backgrounds in that campaign, but yeah, I didn't follow his campaign terribly closely either. I just, I knew there were like a lot of right wing people I knew who were into it, and some Bernie people I knew who were into it. And yeah, it seems like he's kind of like a strange mix of politics as well.
Yeah, no, totally. Right. Like he is a very strange mix of politics. Like it was kind of funny. I think she'd be okay with me outing her about this. Like I remember like a few months ago, I was over at my brother's house, and we were talking about RFK. I think it was actually right after the Jewish Chinese bioweapon comment, right? That and we were talking about that, and my sister-in-law just kind of innocently asked, like, oh, has he always been a Republican? It was like, no, he's running as a Democrat, right? Like she was like, wow, really? Right? Like, and I could kind of see how, if you weren't like obsessively following this stuff, that could be confusing,
Yeah.
because he does, like, RFK does sound like your sort of most hardcore MAGA kind of guy on a certain cluster of issues. But like you said, is a weird combination of things. Like, and even with like I wrote an article for Jacobin shortly after his campaign started, where I was, giving him a hard time about not supporting Medicare for all. But like even there, it's not like he's saying like what a Republican would say about it. It's like, honestly, what he's saying is like pretty much what Biden said when he was running the first time, right? That there should be a public option, whatever, right? So
I think on this, it strikes me like that I feel like he's in an intellectual circle in which like he's pretty much, they're all like exposed to the same, particularly on this issues, they're all exposed to like the same historians, the same news outlets. And often when I see debates on Israel, the pro-Israeli side is like pretty identical. Like they've it seems like they've been prepared with the same pieces of information. Everyone brings up like the 3 no's, and like there's these like these catchphrases working, and I think a lot of people like it just like a lot of the history like just genuinely hasn't occurred to them, they're not reading like Finkelstein or even really like
or even like Israeli historians, your Betty Morrises, or
right.
Yeah, no, totally.
They only relate Benny Morris.
Yeah. I mean, they might like his politics, but they haven't read his factual findings.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Somebody, Antonio, I think, Antonio in the chat says Dave Smith, the anti-Semitic guy. I mean, he is very unmistakably Jewish, so that's like I will say, I've never seen any side of ethnic self-hatred. Like everything I've ever seen him say about this is just sort of like dispossessing people is bad, but maybe he'll surprise me in the debate. Okay, well let's get started. Let's watch the first chunk of this.
Yeah.
Fill her up.
You're listening to the
Fill her up.
You're listening to the Gas Digital Network.
We need to roll back the state. We spy on all of our own citizens. Our prisons are flooded with nonviolent drug offenders. If you want to know who America's next enemy is, look at who we're funding right now. Every single one of these problems are a result of government being way too big.
So in general, I'm going to try to go like 5-10 minutes between pauses, just for the sake of making sure we get all through all this in a reasonable time. But I did just want to say, the first time I was on the show, I mean, I went in, it was when I was living in New Jersey. So I just, took the train in, and, like it's at a studio in Manhattan. We were sitting there, and he played that, that exact same intro at the beginning. And I turned to him as I was like, man, I liked everything until that last line.
Yeah.
So you're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network. Here's your host, Dave Smith.
Hey everybody, welcome back to a brand new episode of Part of the Problem. I am so grateful today to have returning to the show Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Of course, he's been on the show before. It's been a little while. For everybody listening, I'm sure everybody knows he is a candidate for President of the United States of America, an independent candidate, and the first viable third-party candidate since Ross Perot, I would say. So probably the second one in my lifetime who is outside of the two major parties and actually has a chance to be the next president of the United States. So, Mr. Kennedy, thank you so much for joining us again. How are you? How's the campaign trail going?
David, thank you. It's going well. I mean, crowds are getting bigger and bigger and more intense. The polling is good. I'm now leading President Biden and President Trump in Americans under 45 years of age in the 6 battleground states, and then under 35 all across the country. I'm leading in independents, which is the biggest. This is the first election in American history where independents is the biggest voting bloc, and then we're in a 3-way tie with Hispanic votes. I'm polling at 24%, and I think it was the Quinnipiac poll, which puts me only 10 points from victory, because all I need is 34 theoretically to win the election, because it's winner take all.
Yeah, right. Well, it changes things drastically when there's 3 viable candidates rather than 2, which is something we're very not used to seeing in American presidential politics. I mean, and I say this as a member of the Libertarian Party, who I wish we were always offering up a true contender. But the reality of the situation is that just hasn't been the landscape in American politics. As I mentioned, since really Ross Perot in 1992, I think was the last one. And in my lifetime, I think the only one.
Yeah. And then why I heard that you were going to be the candidate for the Libertarian Party, which would have been very exciting. I'm glad I'm not running against you. That would be very formidable. You'd be the most formidable opponent I have. But what happened?
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Yes, there were. I was considering it for a period of time. There were a lot of people in the Libertarian Party who wanted me to run. Ultimately, it just came down to kind of family decisions. I have 2 very little kids, and it just seemed like a little bit too much for me to take on right now. We went through a lot of things. My son had some serious health problems. All better now. He's doing great. But it was just a little bit too much of an undertaking for me in 2024. But maybe in 2028 we'll go head to head.
Would you consider the vice presidency?
Oh man. What are you trying to do to me? You're going to offer me a vice presidency on a Kennedy ticket? That's dangerous. I might end up being president or something like that. Actually, it'd probably be good insurance for you because I'm no LBJ. I don't think they want to get you out of the way.
Exactly why I want you.
So that's it. You want me as your life insurance program? Okay. All right. You know what? Well played.
The worst version of myself that nobody's going to want.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go. Okay. So you know what? I might, in that case, I might consider it, but you got to give me something like my task has to be something very simple that I don't have to leave home from or home for or something like that. So I don't know. Or I could be, listen, here's where we agree. I'll be in charge of your Ukrainian policy. So I'll take that role.
Good. All right.
So, all right. Well, I want to, first off, I really want to say that I really appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate you coming on the first time, but even more so this time. So as you know, and everybody who listens to this show knows, I was extremely interested in your campaign. There was a while there where I swear people listening to the show know almost every other episode of this show, it could have been called the Defending Bobby Kennedy podcast, because it was almost like every week there'd be a new attack on you in the media. And, you know, my producer and my co-host would be emailing me, what are we going to talk about today? And I'd be like, well, they're lying about Bobby again. So let's do a show about that. And your opposition to funding the proxy war in Ukraine, in this insane proxy war of choice on Russia's border, and especially just your deep knowledge of the history and what actually led to this conflict was just nothing short of heroic. Your criticism of the COVID regime and the COVID vaccine and the pharmaceutical industrial complex and the deep state and the neoconservative war machine, all of them I find to be nothing short of heroic. I am, however, deeply disappointed and frankly kind of dumbfounded by your position on Israel's war in Gaza. And I tweeted something to this effect, and you reached out to me immediately afterward and said you'd like to come on the show and discuss it. So that I have nothing but respect for. I think that's a truly noble response. And so I'm grateful that you've come on here. Let's talk about this a little bit, and maybe I can understand where you're coming from better. Maybe there's something that I'm missing. Let me start by asking you this. We are now, as a direct result of this conflict, we have Biden launching bombing campaigns against the Houthis. We've had 3 Americans who were just killed in Jordan. And the big topic on discussion right now is how Biden is going to respond. Of course, all of the hawks, which still permeate our political class, are all calling for war in Iran. Have you changed your position at all on this? Does the threat of a wider war give you pause on kind of the blank check support for Israel's war in Gaza, or are you still steadfast in we must support them till the end?
No, I mean, let me give some context. First of all, I think people who that criticism of Israel is fair, and I encourage people to do that. It's a democracy, and I'm not a fan of Bibi Netanyahu's. I'm a long-term critic of his. I think what happens in the Mideast and everywhere is that the zealots on both sides, the militarists on both sides, feed on each other, and that they have a symbiotic relationship with each other, and that everything they do to escalate the violence and the hatred actually empowers their partner on the other side. And I think Netanyahu is in this very perverse partnership with Hamas. I'm a opponent of the Likud. I was a vocal protester against the so-called judicial reforms in Israel last summer. 20% of the people in Israel came out onto the street, one of the biggest demonstrations in the history of that nation. It has the best judiciary, the most humane judiciary in the world. I'm a lawyer and a constitutional lawyer, and I know there is no judiciary in the world that has taken the positions, the courageous positions that Israel's Supreme Court. By the way, there are Palestinians on that court. And as there are Palestinians at every level of the Israeli judiciary, I oppose the settlements in the West Bank. They're illegal under Israeli law, and they're illegal under international law. And I'm generally opposed to wars. I'm not, I think there are just wars. Very few of the wars that we have fought, particularly in the last century, have been just. I would say World War II is alone in that category. My grandfather vigorously opposed World War I and lost a lot of his friendships during that period. And my uncle John Kennedy felt the same way. We should have never gotten involved in that war. And I feel the same way, that was a war of choice. World War II was not. It was a just war, in my view. We were attacked at Pearl Harbor, and we responded by declaring war on the Japanese and their allies in the Axis power. And Hitler was a disease in Nazism that had to be eradicated. And there would be no peace in the world until Germany was denazified. In fact, at Casablanca, Roosevelt and Churchill had a big fight about it because Roosevelt had made the announcement during Casablanca without checking with Churchill, demanding an unconditional surrender, which meant denazification and the elimination of Hitler. And Churchill got furious at him because he said that's going to cause every German to fight until the last man. And Roosevelt said there will never be any peace until we denazify. And that objective cost 2 million German civilians their lives. So we killed 2 million German civilians in order to destroy Hitler and denazify the government. And as a result of that, we did the same thing in Japan. We have mass destruction of civilians, including bombs, atomic bombs on their cities, which you can argue, a lot of people argue we should not have done. And I think that those arguments have a lot of merit. But the fact is, we did it. And as a result of that, of demilitarizing Japan and denazifying Germany, those countries became two of the richest countries in the world. Germany is the richest country and most powerful country in Europe. And Japan, until the rise of China, was by far the wealthiest country in Asia. Both of them were very, very close allies of the United States. They shared our values. They were friends they've been long-term friends with us, but it required at the outset that we make that profound sacrifice, which included the butchery of millions of people who were innocent. Oh, I see Gaza in the same way, Dave. I'm pro-Palestinian. I want the best for the Palestinian people. I believe in a two-state solution, which Netanyahu does not. I believe that the Palestinians, I have great friendships among the Palestinians. And by the way, I'll say this. A Palestinian pled guilty to the murder of my father. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of evidence that he had killed my father. He was certainly part of the ambush that killed my father. And then that was in 1968. And my family wrote a letter to Judge Walker at that time, pleading with the judge not to give Sirhan the death penalty, even though everybody in my family believed that he had killed my father. And then in 1971, my elder brother Joe, who was older than me by 1 year, was hijacked by Palestinian terrorists and who demanded the release of Sirhan. And his plane was landed in the desert in Yemen and then blown up and burned. And luckily, my brother was released. But, I have plenty of reason if I wanted to hold a grudge against Palestinians. But for the past 10 years, I've worked hard and soul to get Sirhan out of prison for two reasons. One, I believe that he served more time than he was sentenced to, and that he served the parole board. Let's put it this way: the parole board has said that he should be released, that he posed no threat. And the other is, the evidence that I found that that the bullets that he fired, although he did fire bullets at my father, those were not the ones that killed my dad. I believe in justice for whoever it is. And I've worked, I've been to Ramallah, I've been to the West Bank, I have friends in Gaza, I've met with the Palestinian Authority leadership, I've met with Palestinians all over. In fact, one of my groups, the Jordan River Keeper, it was the only group in Israel that had Palestinians on its board, Jordanians and Israeli Jews. I understand the issues that affect the Palestinians. I want them to live lives of happiness, prosperity, dignity, and freedom and sovereignty. I do not believe that can happen as long as Hamas is in charge. And I believe Hamas is very much akin to the Nazi problem, that until they are eradicated, that Palestinians will not have a chance to live in the kind of prosperity that they deserve. And that over the long term, people have to understand that.
All right. For the last 5 minutes or so, I've been thinking, okay, I'm just going to wait for him to finish this answer, and then we'll pause. But I think I've officially given up. Let's just pause.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't look, I know,
Lots to unpack.
One loquacious motherfucker to another, but I mean, like that was ridiculous.
Yeah.
like it just, I mean, I saw a comment, I don't remember who's, anyway, somebody said that there was, that he was filibustering his own answer. And it definitely felt like that at times. It's like, well, okay, so we got this, we got like some like extended throat clearing about, I don't like Netanyahu or Likud or Netanyahu's judicial reform, and I have Palestinian friends, and blah blah blah. And then we went into like 10 minutes on World War II. And then there was actually a pretty direct answer to the question, but instead of stopping talking, I think we just got like 5 minutes on Sirhan.
Yeah. I mean, let's not forget, like, the question was, has your position on this issue changed since we attacked the Houthis, and it has posed the threat of creating a larger conflict? And
I literally forgot that was the question until you said that, right? Because it's like, what did he start this out by asking? Was it like, what are your general thoughts about Israel-Palestine? Like, even if that had been the question, that would have been a completely ridiculous answer. But in everything I just described, there was absolutely nothing about the risks of a wider war, which is like, amazing, because it's like, look, this is a really good question to ask RFK Jr., because such a big part of his appeal is that he's supposed to be an anti-war candidate, that like, anybody who likes RFK Jr. because of like what he's saying about Ukraine and all this stuff presumably thinks it's really bad that the United States spent decades in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's like, well, shit, if this spirals into a wider regional war involving the United States, that would be really bad even if you don't care about the Palestinians. So yeah, really good question. I mean, granted, I'm sure there'll be another 20 minutes till he stops talking, but so far, no answer.
Yeah. Yeah, he was like, has your position changed on Gaza since this happened? And he was like, well, here's a bunch of other positions about other things that I've held for a really long time. And let me tell you what I think about World War One.
It's like, oh, do I get, look, I know you're pissed off about what I think about Gaza, but do I get 8 points for being against World War One?
Yeah. Yeah, and then he also goes off on this thing about like firebombing Dresden and nuking Japan, and how that led to, or that was like a sacrifice we made to win World War One, which is like military historians disagree with that, by the way. Like there are strong arguments that there were not really any military objectives accomplished by that. That's not like universally agreed on. There's like debate over that, but
yeah, I mean, which and it's like
also like Japan had surrendered, I think by the time that we nuked them. Is that right?
No, not exactly. So the surrender wasn't until after Nagasaki. Well, the unconditional surrender wasn't until after Nagasaki. I think what is true, and I mean, this is just off the top of my head. Somebody in the chat could correct me if I'm getting this history wrong. But I think the thing that is true that you're probably thinking of is that Japan like had definitely expressed like willingness to like negotiate on like a conditional surrender, certainly before Nagasaki, maybe even before Hiroshima. And then, but actually, as RFK Jr. just said, I mean, he was talking about Germany in that case, right? But like at that point in the war, the Allies were like, no, nothing except for an unconditional surrender is gonna do, right? So yeah, I mean, this is, and there is like, I know certainly, I guess I don't know. Maybe like I'm unclear if this is what you were saying. Like if I mean, I assume people have these arguments about the firebombing of Dresden. I'm just not familiar with what military historians have said about this, but like I know in the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that there's like plenty of dispute about whether you really needed to do that to get the unconditional surrender. Even putting aside, that's like, no, seriously, you couldn't like, if you were facing, like, let's say for the sake of argument, you were really facing the choice that Truman apologists always say that you were, that it's like either there was going to be a land invasion that was going to mean the loss of lives of like this huge number of U.S. troops, or you could commit like one of the most serious war crimes ever committed and like nuke entire cities, or you could have a negotiated surrender instead of an unconditional surrender. It's like, I don't know. I mean, like, real hard to make a case that that last one would have been worse than the second one.
Yeah, I just think that like in general, like it's hard to make the case that like we won World War II and then helped like contributed to redeveloping all these nations like because we firebombed Germany, or in the case of Japan because we nuked them. Like that wasn't the thing that like made those countries like functioning again. It was like post-war planning that like, which there's plenty to be debated about there, but like it wasn't the firebombing that like
it's like, just because I mean, I've actually been I've actually been reading the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Just figured it's a classic and I never got around to it, and I'm like, I don't know, 4/5 or 5/6 the way through that book right now, and it's like,
I knew that guy who wrote that.
Oh no shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting book, but it's like, you definitely like well before the point that I got to, it's like there's all this like, yeah, and Hitler's generals were super confused about why he wanted to declare war on the United States, because he was already at war with both England and Russia, and like there's a lot of like, it seemed like the position that Germany was in by like midway through the war. It's like it seemed really hard to see any scenario where they would have won at that point, because it's like they were taking on sort of simultaneously 3 of the most developed industrial powerhouses in the world, and it's like it just didn't seem, I mean, it whatever. I know it's a hot take, but I think Hitler was kind of crazy, and that's I think he wasn't going to, but like also just because in terms of where he's going with it, right? Because we finally got it a couple minutes before I gave up and press pause, that it like where he's going with it in terms of the Gaza Hamas analogy, like one, as you point out, he's not answering the original question. At best, this is an incredibly long-winded and digressive answer to a different question, which is, how can you support what Israel is doing given all the civilian deaths in Gaza, right?
Yeah.
And also, you pointed this out when we had Nathan Robinson on and we were talking about that Brett Stevens article about Gaza. It is incredibly telling that all these guys who make these arguments, like RFK Jr. is making right now, are going back to World War II to like try to come up with justifying precedents. Because it's like, okay, one, like my entire adult life that I've been aware of, like war and politics, fucking everything is always compared to World War II, and it's incredibly annoying. Like most
change, fighting climate change.
yeah, I'm fighting climate change, World War II, but like Saddam Hussein was Hitler. Osama bin Laden was Hitler. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Manuel Noriega being Hitler for like 2 seconds. Like everybody's Hitler, and it's like, no, I don't know. I'm pretty sure there was only one, right? But two, like to what they're trying to justify, it's really telling that they're going back to World War II, because they're going back to before current international law was actually codified with the Second Geneva Convention, right? The late 1940s.
That comes up, yeah,
because it's like, I mean, this is. So it's like you're justifying this by reference to things that, by the way, were incredibly controversial at the time, right? Yeah. Like within the United States and Britain, lots of people who supported the war were horrified by the firebombing of Dresden and objected to it at the time. Yeah. And in fact, there was like kind of a pullback because of that. And two, like the whole reason that we had the Second Geneva Convention was like, look, this is after the horrors of World War II. We want to make sure that no war is ever fought this way again. So like, it's just like after all that, being like, oh no, this is totally fine. Killing tons of civilians by, doing these things, like it's fine because like we did that in World War II and that was good.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's like the one that that's like the instance from which that we're told to like never forget, but it's obviously used as like a justification to impose massive suffering on a group of people. I wasn't sure if we passed this, but did he reference something about Hamas being like as long as Hamas is in charge?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
This is like another thing I hear a lot, like these days, even amongst people who like oppose what Israel is doing right now, or like oppose the response. They are like, but I do agree that like Hamas can't be in charge. And I think this came up in the Eli Lake debate too. He said something like, as Hamas rules over the Gaza Strip. And it's just like, I don't know, like who is in charge of Gaza? Like who rules the Gaza Strip? Last I checked, like, and this is obviously something Finkelstein, I think, brought up too, in the debate with him, is like, Israel controls what goes in, controls what goes out, controls who goes in, who goes out. They control the air, they control the water, they control the border. Like,
I mean, Hamas, the Hamas government in Gaza was literally a subcontractor of the Israeli military, right? I mean, they were the ones who were ultimately in charge of everything, but like some government functions were ceded to them, just like, you know, some functions are ceded to the Palestinian Authority in parts of the West Bank. And in fact, they got like payment for that, right? Like literally like a subcontractor.
Yeah.
And it's not like, this is, you know, it's just wild. Like, okay, I think your point is very well taken. You're absolutely right. Like, I mean, it's like silly to say that Hamas ruled Gaza. Israel ruled Gaza. They very tightly controlled the entire time after the, you know, after they you know, pulled out the ground troops and the settlements up until the beginning of the current operation, right? That entire time period, like Israel very tightly controlled, you know, the land borders, the sea borders, the airspace. You know, they have like anytime anything that was going on in Gaza they objected to, they would bomb it, right? You know, that's like under those circumstances, denying that Israel ruled Gaza is absurd. But also, like, even ignoring that, it's like I just, it's like, look, more than one thing can be bad. You could say that, you know, Hamas is very bad and they're very, you know, in many ways, right? Like, you know, they're very authoritarian. They haven't allowed elections in forever, right? You know, that's, you know, lot, you know, but like, but one, there are lots of groups that are very bad that are not the Nazis, right? Like, not everything has to be the Nazis, right? In order to be bad. Like, that's just like, just calm down on that, right? Like, this is, you know, and like the whole thing about the Nazis was that they weren't just like trying to rule some like 25-mile long patch of Europe, right? They were trying to rule the world. And like, that's part of why stopping the Nazis, you know, was such an overwhelming imperative. You know, and nobody anywhere thinks that Hamas has the capacity to take over like Israel, never mind the world, right? Or the West Bank even, right? So like, that's just kind of ridiculous on its face. And also,
They can't even take over Gaza.
yeah. Can't even assert complete. Yeah. Can't even like actually complete the takeover of Gaza. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, can't control the land, you know, or sea borders, can't control the airspace, can't, you know, all that stuff. Right.
Yeah. No, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
You know, in fact, it's so funny how many people say like talk about Gaza as if it were an independent state, who will also say, when they're like making anti-immigration points about the US, that you're not a real country if you don't control your own borders. It's
Right.
like, well, come on, man, which is it? But yeah, I mean, they can't even like actually completely taking over Gaza and like seceding and forming like the state of Gaza is well beyond the capacity of Hamas. Never mind taking over the West Bank, never mind taking over Israel, never mind like some Hitler-like scheme of world conquest. So saying like, yeah, it was really important to stop the Nazis, therefore this is just like that, because the Nazis were bad and Hamas is bad, so therefore, you know, Nazis equal Hamas, is ridiculous. Yeah, on its face. And also, like, look, you can think that Hamas being in charge, even to the extent that they are, is a bad thing, without saying therefore anything goes.
Yeah.
To
Bad that
stop that from being the case. It's bad that Saddam Hussein was in charge of Iraq. I mean, he was a mass murderous, awful dictator, but that doesn't justify the invasion of Iraq.
and like because we committed war crimes there, or because Israel committed, you know, like we also wouldn't argue that like they should invade Washington, you know, like I think it's like a pretty like general standard, you know.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there are lots of good, like,
Nobody has a knife is Gaza, not Washington.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah, there are lots of governments all over the world I wish didn't exist, but like
Most of them.
yeah, most of them, right? Vast majority, right? Pretty much all of them, honestly, but
Yeah.
that's to varying extents, right? But like, yeah, I have, but that doesn't mean that I think that it would be okay to do to those countries even what the United States did in Iraq in 2003. Never mind what Israel is doing in Gaza, which is on an entirely different level from Iraq in 2003. Like Iraq, the population of Iraq is many, many times the population of Gaza, but vastly more people have been killed in Gaza in the last several months than were killed in 2003 in Iraq. We didn't, as bad as the invasion of Iraq was. I mean, I spent a lot of time organizing anti-war protests in 2003. It's still like we didn't displace 90% of the population of Iraq from their homes, right? So it's like that's as
nor did we annex Iraq,
No, also important point. Yeah. All right, let's keep going.
This was the 5th attack. So every previous attack was ended with a ceasefire, and every one of those ceasefires, Hamas used to rearm, to regroup, to rehoist its banner, and then to attack Israel again.
Okay. All right, guys, let's take a moment and thank our sponsor for today's show, which is Survival Gear BSO. Pre-made bug-out bags that offer easy grab-and-go options for families. They offer access to survival training and courses from the most qualified.
Man, I admitted my fondness for Dave earlier, but I do love the advertising of right-wing shows.
Yeah.
It's always the best one. Was one that Jake and Andy and I were watching that like on some small right-wing show in Rumble, where they just they like seamlessly transition from whatever they're talking about to doing a plug for Trump trading cards.
Yeah, dude, you got to get those.
Always interested to see what people have been sold. But yeah, I also forgot to say earlier and all that the thing about how amazing the Israeli judiciary was, I was really choking on at the time, because it's like,
oh yeah,
come on, like how often has the Israeli judiciary actually like stopped like land theft or they have very rarely, right? Like they, in fact, like this is a Supreme Court that notoriously made a decision that's pretty fucking anomalous in the Western world and much of the non-Western world to say that torture wasn't totally disallowed under certain circumstances, caveat, right?
Yeah.
So it's like let's not, I understand that like having the judiciary at least do what it was doing to block some of the worst stuff is still better than what Netanyahu wanted, but like let's not gush over how amazing the Israeli judiciary is.
He makes it sound like extremely multicultural and like democratic, and I mean he also says there's Palestinians plural on the Supreme Court, and there's just one. I think I could be mistaken about that, but I believe there's just one.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's not, and it's also so funny the way that they always bring that up. Like that's it's like, okay, so yes, those Palestinians whose families ended up on the right side of the Green Line after the initial Nakba, right, did eventually get citizenship and close to equal rights in Israel, and like, sure, they do many things that citizens of any country would do, but like, what does that prove exactly? Like, it's still the case that all the Palestinians on the other side of the Green Line have spent 57 years, close to, right? Because we're getting up to the 57th anniversary of the 6 Day War, 57 years as subjects but not citizens of the state of Israel, subject to military courts instead of regular civilian courts. Those people sure as fuck aren't like serving in the Knesset or in the Supreme Court. And of course, those Palestinian refugees who ended up outside of the country entirely aren't allowed to come back. So it's like, yeah, right. Like there is a subcategory of this population that does have equality in some important respects, right? Discriminated against in other ways, but like they do have like certain important rights and whatever. But like that doesn't make it okay that there are these other subcategories of the population that don't have any of those rights.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. There was just one small point where he talks about how like a Palestinian might have possibly killed his dad, but he doesn't think he did. And I don't know, like if he thinks that that's like,
well, it was so weird because he was like, oh,
like more charitable towards Palestinians because one of them tried to kill his dad, I guess. But it's also, I think it's like an argument that it's an argument that like mostly white people make, where it's like, even though this other race did some horrible thing, this person of this other race did this horrible thing, like
yeah,
I don't hate all of them.
Yeah.
A white person, right? Like, oh, white guy tried to kill my dad, so now, whether it's cool that I don't mind white people or like I hate all white people, like it's just
because like although the version he's giving is one that's like, I think it would be easier to see how fucked up it was if you substituted a different group, right? Like it's like it's like, imagine somebody being like, oh, at one time I thought that a black guy had killed my dad, so
it's amazing that I like black guys,
So but it's like, look, I don't hate all black people. Don't I get some kind of prize for that?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, oh yeah, a black guy mugged me in 1997, but I still didn't join the KKK. So like that's like, actually, if anything,
and if anybody's allowed to, right? Like,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
U.S. That is the website survivalgear.us, and make sure to use the promo code %off your entire order. All right, let's get back into the show. Okay, well, let me respond to some of this, because I think that, look, the examples of Germany and Japan, where quite frankly, what we did was indiscriminately slaughter their civilian population in World War II, the biggest bloodbath in human history. It is absolutely true that after that was done, we pulled them back into the global world order, into the liberal world order. And that, listen, despite we could spend 3 hours talking about World War II, but I will say, okay, that is quite an accomplishment. It's also the accomplishment that almost every hawk and every neocon looks to as an example for why this is going to work and why we can go overthrow this government, why we can go start a war here. Believe, as we all know, and you yourself know as well as anyone, this was used over and over again for the justification of the war in Iraq. And of course, back then, Saddam Hussein was Hitler, Muammar Gaddafi was Hitler, Bashar al-Assad was Hitler. I got to say, the comparison between... Let me just finish this.
All those wars.
Yes, I know you did, which is why I'm so dumbfounded about your position on this one. To compare the Nazi problem to the Hamas problem, the Nazis ruled from France to Poland. They had almost all of Europe taken over and were then going after England and Russia. Hamas doesn't even rule Gaza. They're the toughest gang in an Israeli prison. So to compare these two as if there's any, anywhere near the same threat to the civilized world is just the comparison falls immediately. And on top of that, if you want to say that, well, we want the Palestinians to live these great lives, and the reason they can't do that is because of Hamas, well, that certainly doesn't seem to be the reason in the West Bank. And the Palestinians have, since 1967, lived under totalitarianism. And it's just totally inexcusable. There's just no justification for it. Israel won a war in 1967. I'm glad you admitted that the settlements are illegal under international law. It's also illegal under international law to gain territory through war. Israel gained the West Bank and Gaza through war. They have absolutely no legal claim on these territories, and no moral claim on these territories for that matter either. There's nothing there, and they've held them since 1967. Now, yes, it is true that the resistance movements against them have taken some ugly forms, and Hamas, who of course, as you also know well, has been supported and propped up by Israel throughout the years. Yes, they've grown into a very ugly terrorist group, and what they did on October 7th was horrible. But the obvious answer here is that we need to, and it's certainly an American president's perspective, should be that we need to be encouraging the peace process here. I mean, you talk about we have to eradicate Hamas. Okay, so U.S. officials, as of right now, they estimate that about 20% of Hamas has been eradicated. Right now, 50% of the homes in Gaza have been destroyed. So what are we going to do? Destroy all of them? Do we honestly think? I mean, it's almost like you're doing insurgent math here, like General McChrystal warned against. So what do you think? We'll just destroy all of Gaza, and then we won't have to deal with this Hamas problem anymore. Although what you've already seen right now from the Houthis, from Hezbollah, from Iran, from everybody in this region, you're seeing, and of course, Shiite-controlled Iraq. Thank you, George W. Bush, and Shiite-controlled Syria. You're only going to drum up more hatred. I think this is the worst move for the security of the Israeli people of any of the available options.
Okay, so all of those arguments sound good. So let me deconstruct them. Mm-hmm. First of all, I was not comparing the Hamas, the threat of Hamas as a global threat to the Nazis. That's not where they're similar. Where they're similar is that it's an ideology-driven conflict that's not territorial and has no negotiating position. It's a group that is committed to the genocide of all Jews, not only in Israel but all over the world, and that is committed to the annihilation of Israel, and that has in its covenant a prohibition against even negotiating with Israel, except as a ruse. So their covenant says that's a violation, it's a sin against Islamic law to even negotiate with Israel. So the big question I would have for you, and I'll ask it at the end, is what is your path to peace? Is it, the people who are demanding a temporary, an unconditional ceasefire are leaving the hostages there. They're leaving. Hamas is firing hundreds of missiles a day onto Tel Aviv. People say that Gaza is one of the most densely populated places in the world. That's not true. Tel Aviv has twice the population density, and they're firing hundreds of missiles a day. How is Israel supposed to stop that? They fired 30,000 missiles between 2006 and October 7th, and they fired 10,500 since October 7th. What other nation in the world would put up with that, with a neighbor firing missiles onto their civilian population after declaring that they intend to annihilate the nation and to kill all of its citizens? Now, you said that you made a statement that is absolutely incorrect, which is that you cannot claim that under international law, it's illegal to claim territory. And you won a war.
To acquire territory through war.
If you are fighting a defensive war, it is absolutely legal. And I can name you 100 precedents. Take land that was used to launch a war against you, and that is strategically important to your country. After Germans attacked us, do you think we broke up Germany? Yes, we did. We removed the Sudetenland. We gave it to Czechoslovakia. We broke up the entire Ottoman Empire, which was and we took all of it, 100% of their territory, and we gave it to people. We invented new.
Hold on, you're talking about before international law.
After World War I, we created 22 new nations. After World War II, we created 122.
Yes, but as you know, sir,
maps, cutting up territory, slicing and dicing, and we did that because international law allows, particularly when you're fighting a defensive war, to claim strategic land that was used against you.
Okay, let me just respond to a couple things there, because as you know, sir, if you're talking about World War I, well, this is before all of these international laws were put into effect, which were a response to World War II. So that is a little bit
after World War II.
Yes, but I'm just saying, as far as the portion of World War I goes, there's that. But number two, is your claim that the 1967 war was a defensive war and therefore it's okay? Because look, Menachem,
1967 war.
Yes.
Well, then I would say, yeah, the 1967 war was a defensive war because Israel made clear, and Egypt understood this, that closing the straits was an existential threat to Israel.
Okay, well, Menachem Begin himself said that it was a war of choice and that we did not know for sure that the war was necessary. We chose to launch that war. Now, he goes on to defend it, of course, because Menachem Begin is a terrorist, and he's fine with that. And by the way, I don't say that as a pejorative term. The guy was literally a self-described terrorist who committed many acts of terrorism. But I'm sorry, pre-creation of Israel, not just the post-creation of Israel. And he's the founder of the Likud party. But even like the most hardcore Zionists like Ben Shapiro or Dennis Prager, they all refer to it as a preemptive war. Look, I don't even necessarily care.
It was preemptive. It was preemptive because Egypt announced that it was going to close the straits. And Israel knew that if they did that and they didn't attack Egypt's air force while it was still on the ground, that Israel would be destroyed. So they made a choice against an existential threat.
So let's say they're justified.
By the way, put this in context of the 48 war. They refused to sign it. All of these 8 nations refused to sign a peace agreement after 48 war, recognizing Israel's existence. So that war essentially was continuing. And it continued again. There was another preemptive war by the Arabs alone, surprise war in 1973.
But what's the other side of that story?
Each one of those wars, after each one, Israel offered to return all of the lands that it had taken in exchange for peace. And the Arabs refused consistently until 1978, when Egypt finally, and Jordan said, Egypt first, and then Jordan 4 years later said, okay, we will trade land for peace. And they did it. But the Palestinians have never done that.
Oh, well, okay, hold on.
They've offered it again and again. They've been offered the pre-67 borders in 2001 by Ehud Barak, and by Omar in 2008. They were the return of all of their land in exchange for peace. And Mahmoud Abbas refused to utter the words that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish nation. He would not say those words. And in 2001, Yasser Arafat walked away from what, Prince Bandar called heartbreaking concessions. And you, listen, you're shaking your head because you have a different view of history. But here's the thing, is if you read the article that Bassem Eid did this week in Newsweek, who was the leading human rights activist in the West Bank, his chronicle of history is identical to what I just told you. So, and he is an Arab Palestinian lover and activist. And you can say, well, I have a different, history, and you and I can go back and forth on our different recountations of history for the next 10 hours. It's not going to get anywhere. So all I'd say to you is respect that my view of history is what I believe from extensive investigation that I believe is objective. I read both sides.
Sir, but I'm sorry, but it's not. No, but it's not.
You believe that your recounting of those, peace agreements and why they fell apart. I can show you chapter and verse about that supports my position on it. And you can show me, quotes from Menachem Begin that disagree.
But sir, this is almost like if somebody was saying that, because as we discussed last time we were on the podcast, the whole history of the run up to this war in Ukraine. And if somebody is just saying like, no, none of that's true. NATO never encroached on Vladimir Putin. They were never talking about bringing Ukraine into NATO. It was just that Vladimir Putin wants to reconstruct the Soviet Union. And they can say, well, I have my history and you have yours, but I'm sorry. There's like, no, there's an objective reality to this.
All right. So just like I'm sure Dave, to his credit, is almost certainly about to make a bunch of these points. So I don't want to linger too much on this, but it is crazy that one, it's just insane to say that the Palestinians were ever offered the pre-1967 borders by Israel. That is just a thing that objectively has never happened, and like has
Arafat just walked away.
Yeah, and no, like Alan Dershowitz, for example, right? Like he's a piece of shit. Like he's very dishonest, but he would never say that, right? Because it's like he would know that he would be instantly corrected, right? He would say, he might say, oh, Arafat walked away from like a good deal or something like that, right? But he wouldn't say Arafat walked away from the pre-1967 borders, because he knows that's not true, and he knows he'd get called on it, right? If he said it, right? This is the there's no peace deal that any Israeli government has ever hinted at being willing to adopt that would have gone all the way to the pre-1967 borders. Like that's just a wild thing to claim. And also it's just
there are worse deals that the Palestinians were closer to accepting and the Israelis rejected anyways.
Yeah, right. Also true, right? But it's like just the idea that like there was ever a point where Israel was willing to withdraw all the way to the pre-1967 borders just isn't true. Yeah. And again, I think most sort of more sophisticated apologists for Israel would never say it was true. And it's also just like real. It's so sleazy to spend like, I don't know, there was like well over 10 minutes, I think, between pausing, or at least about 10 minutes. And the vast majority of that was just RFK Jr. talking. And so it's like, it's so sleazy to spend 10 minutes making all of these claims that range somewhere from like sketchy to flatly untrue. And then like, as you're wrapping it up before the other person has had a chance to talk, like you just spend 10 minutes laid out the whole narrative. That's like, look, we could spend all day going back and forth about, who rejected what. Let's not bother with any of that. It's like, no, you just said your thing, the other person gets to respond to it.
Yeah. And he's like, I can show you like books where it says what I'm saying. And, it's like, what, why don't you just tell us what they say?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, right.
It makes it seem like, oh, now I have to go like get all these books. And
yeah, I mean, look, if you're going to mention the books, name the fucking books. If you're not going to name the books, just tell us what they say.
Yeah.
Like just repeat what you learned from the book.
Take better notes when you're reading, like all sorts of solutions to this.
And it's so crazy that he's like, oh, I read stuff from both sides, or whatever. It's like, I don't know. I mean, like, what exactly have you read? Right. Yeah. Like, because like that's what that question really invites, right? It's like, so did you read like Norm's Gaza book? Have you read like the 100-Year War Against Palestine? Like, tell me what you read.
Right. I think to him, it's like Dershowitz at the liberal end and like Dennis Prager. That's both sides.
I mean, that would be very consistent with what he's saying. Yeah. Like, I see no evidence of anything beyond that spectrum having penetrated his awareness here. Also, just the thing that he said about like, okay, so I mean, Dave already called him on the thing about World War One, like trying to use World War One as an example of why you're allegedly allowed to like get territory from defensive wars. But two, even as far as the World War II thing goes, RFK is doing this like pretty blatant conflation of two different things, right? When he's talking about, you know, dividing up countries or creating new nations, whatever. It's like, look, whatever you think the legitimacy or illegitimacy of any of that is, that's a very different thing from incorporating their territory into your own country.
Yeah, annexing it.
Yeah. Like
Uh,
that's completely different. Like annexing is what you're not allowed to
also,
like,
I think still not legal in a defensive war under international law.
yeah, I'm fairly sure that that's right.
Yeah.
That was certainly my understanding before I watched this, that even in a defensive war, you're not allowed to annex territory gained in the war. And I guess I don't know off the top of my head about East and West Germany, because that was one of his examples. But certainly in other cases, right, there were there were like referendums to like legitimize partitions, once they happened at the end of World War II. And so yeah, I mean,
there's also a weird thing he gets into where he's like, listen, after World War I, we had 22 more countries. After World War II, we had 121 or something. And then it's just like, okay, like, therefore what? Like, therefore, it's like, okay, now it's okay to subtract one. We've added a bunch of other ones, so we can one now. That's probably fine.
Yeah,
no, we get to decide.
Argument.
Yeah, like, I didn't really get where.
Yeah, it just seems like such a huge non sequitur.
Yeah, you really can just draw the lines of countries you've been to war with.
Also, it's crazy that one of his examples of like how it's okay to redraw the borders of countries you've been to war with, that one of his examples was taking the Sudetenland land away from Germany and giving it to Czechoslovakia. It's like, wait, back up.
Yeah.
How did Germany get the Sudetenland land?
Yeah, exactly.
That was, like there were, Czechoslovakia was intimidated into giving it up as part of like a sequence of events that ended with the entire country being overrun by the Nazis, right? That's like, that's restoring the legitimate borders. That's not, that's not like, oh, okay, we just get to arbitrarily mess with your borders because of defensive war.
Yeah. He also says this thing about how the Palestinians have never agreed to a land for peace agreement. And which, like, I guess is like in a way true, but it's also like they've still lost a lot of fucking land.
Well, I mean, all of it, right? So
yeah, it's like, yeah,
because
0% of like
0% of the original territory of the British Mandated Palestine is currently in anything but Israeli hands, right? So I mean, they never, it is true that they never agreed to a specific plan, right? Just like it's true that the Israelis never agreed to a specific two-state plan. In both cases, you can find both sides offering plans to the other one, right? But like they never like agreed on the same one. That's true. But like his presentation of it made it sound.
The thing is, like, it's just like to look at a country that's like being invaded and terrorized all the time and having its land taken and be like, the problem there is that they're not accepting land for peace agreements is just like,
yeah. And it's also, by the way, like if you look at like one of the things that when people are going through their Lindy's, and I'm kind of amazed that we didn't explicitly get the 3 no's of Khartoum. You mentioned that earlier, but I'm sure they're coming.
I bet we will, yeah.
But like when people are going through their litany of Arab rejectionism over the decades, and it's, whatever, it's like honestly, I think it's pretty over the top racist because in order to cobble together these lists, it always needs to be Arabs, not like Palestinians in particular. Because otherwise too much of the pre-1988 stuff, would be relevant. But or almost all of the pre-1988 stuff. But when when people are doing this, right, they're saying that, the Arabs, right, this collective entity, right, of like all of these different nations, that speak Arabic, had done rejectionism. One of the things that people bring up is like the 1936 or 7, right, the Peel Commission, and that is very telling, right? And the same thing for like when he talks about 1948 and like the UN partition plan, which as pointed out in the chat by Jemt, right, that like even the pre-1967 borders are still way more expansive for Israel than the original UN partition plan. But the UN partition plan, like the sort of Arab rejection of the UN partition plan, and before that of the Peel Commission, it's like, yeah, people who wanted to have their own independent country weren't willing to agree to have a huge part of that sliced off and turned into something else. That doesn't mean that they wanted to like force all Jewish residents of Palestine to leave, right? Like that just meant that they didn't want to do a partition of the country. And that's like a distinction that's really important. That's nowhere mentioned. In fact, like if you look at the original Arab High Council stuff about the Peel Commission, they're like, yeah, sure, of course, equal rights for Jews within this, but like we don't want a partition of the country. And like just equating that with like the sort of worst stuff in the original Hamas charter or whatever is incredibly inaccurate. And it's also the other thing that was super misleading is when he says, Mahmoud Abbas wasn't willing to say the words Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish nation. It's like, look, the PLO had recognized Israel's right to exist way the fuck back at the beginning of the 1990s.
Yeah.
Right. And really even before that. But I mean, like, that's when they did like the big renunciation of their original charter and, all that stuff. And, I mean, really they had been, pushing the idea of a 2-state solution, well before the 90s, but like they have, going back to like, I think like the early 80s, maybe even, but like they had recognized that since the early 90s. By the way, like, can argue about whether they should, right? It's like, is it in fact, I think there are some pretty basic kind of democratic principles that would lead you to think that like what you should actually want ideally is a single state with equal rights for everybody. But whatever you think of, and I'm very sympathetic to that. I've been for a long time, but even if say, okay, look, PLO has been pragmatic enough to like abandon that forever, right? And has recognized Israel's right to exist forever. So I think the trick when he says that is that phrase as a Jewish nation. It's not just that, like, it's not like Mahmoud Abbas wasn't like on board with, yes, Israel could exist within the pre-1967 borders. We'll diplomatically recognize it, not try to take anything, whatever. It's that you have to like affirm its right to be an ethno state, which is like a huge middle finger to the Palestinian minority within Israel proper.
Yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, not to change the subject too much from what you're just saying, but there's another kind of like there's just another like misleading line here where he's talking about how he brings up the fact that in its covenant Hamas won't negotiate with Israel unless it's a ruse. And I think it's pretty clear like who's not negotiating right now. Like the US and Israel are always saying they won't negotiate with terrorists, or they won't negotiate with Hamas. So like even for hostage exchanges in some cases, even to release hostages in some cases. So it's just kind of like another double standard. But what you're saying earlier too is like another thing that comes up a lot where they're bringing up how like this or that Arab country is like not doing something that would really like take the onus off the US having to worry about it. Like, I mean, Egypt is often the one that's targeted the most for this right now. I mean, sometimes it's Jordan, depending on like where the history, where you're looking in the history. But I think particularly right now, because there's, you know, some pressure on Egypt to open the border, but it's really like the whole rationale seems to just be that they are Arab countries.
Yeah.
You know, whereas again, it's just another thing, almost like the thing before where he was talking about the Palestinian guy, suspect of killing his dad. It's like it's just a way of like lumping everybody in together where like you just wouldn't if it sounded more obviously
Right.
rolling off the tongue.
Yeah. Mankarud in the chat says, you know, I think we should try to find genetic descendants of the original Philistines or whoever at first give it to them. Yeah, I mean, this is always the funny thing about this to me, because it's like, look, I don't think that there's anything like I'll see people having these weird arguments about who counts as like the indigenous group or whatever historically, and it's like I just could not give less of a shit about that. Like I'm completely uninterested in that. Nobody's human rights should have to be linked to like where their ancestors lived. Like that's not an interesting question to me. Like you should you know, I mean, I just think that everybody who lives in an area should have equal rights in an area. And if people were kicked out, they should be, you know, allowed to come home. That doesn't even necessarily mean, you know, allowed to like reclaim the original plot of land if other people have been living there for a certain amount of time or whatever. I mean, like that's all complicated, but like you certainly shouldn't be like excluded from like returning to the area. That's grotesque, right? You know, and I would say the same thing if like a bunch of Israeli Jews were kicked out tomorrow, right? Like, and then, you know, and then like their families weren't allowed to come back, or whatever. It's like that's, you know, I mean, all of this stuff, you don't have to have any kind of special pleading based on history or, you know, what happened, you know, like how many generations, you know, who's been living where, and, you know, whatever. It's like none of that should matter. It should just be like basic principles about the rights that you think that everybody should have should like also apply to Palestinians because they're people.
Yeah. I mean, I think RFK he thinks that like he thinks that the Jews in Israel are like the Jews to Israel are like the Native Americans to the United States.
But that's the thing. I don't care about that, right? It's like, look, it is, you know, I have like, you know, because like people will have this whole argument about that. It's like, oh, who counts? Like, because like there's this sort of weird like woke Zionism now that like relies on making exactly that kind of point, right?
Yeah,
That's like, you know, that's like, oh, see, if you think about it, the Jews are really the indigenous ones, because, you know, before they were kicked out by the Romans, it's like, I don't care about any of this at all, right? It's like I don't care who's indigenous or whatever that even means. Like it's like, you know, nobody's human rights should depend on where their ancestors lived, right? Like that's like I have that's just not an important consideration for anything, right? That's like nobody has more or less the right to live in any place because like their ancestors lived there, didn't live there, whatever. It's like that's like everybody should just have equal rights, you know, wherever they live, right?
Even if you're making it as like a historical comparison to how like certain people have been fucked over, it, you know, makes no
sense. I mean, in order to make the comparison, it would have to be the case that like we were talking about Native Americans coming back to the US in like 2000 years when there was some group
exactly that,
like that like didn't speak English and had very little connection to us that was living there now. And like, that's like, it's like at that point, it's like a lot less, it's like the analogy gets strained.
Yeah, we're talking about like a couple hundred years ago.
Right.
Like
yeah. But like, I don't even like, I have I don't even like land acknowledgements. We were talking about that in the conversation with Amber. I think like colonialism and the fucking over the Native Americans was very bad, right? But like, I don't even like talking about in terms of like who's the what are the original lands of who or whatever. Because it's like, I don't know. Historically, there kind of is no original. There's like always war and conflict, and like that's like none of it. Like all that should matter are that you. Like all human beings, just by virtue of being human beings, deserve to have, to live in safety and have their material needs met and have kind of some kind of democratic input into the government that rules over them, right? Like that's and that's like that's all you need, right, to navigate any of this stuff, right? Like just all of this sort of like I don't know. I mean, it kind of reminds me of I don't know if you. I don't know if you watched any of the Tucker Carlson Putin interview, but
I actually would really like to watch it, but I have not seen the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. Like I haven't seen the whole thing yet. I actually might on the show, but but like he goes on this like super extended digression into like it's like talking about stuff that happened in the 16th century. And it's like, I don't know. You got to go more recent than that to have a compelling claim about stuff going on right now. But in any case, though, we only have like, we're like 3/4 of the way through the main show, and so we should get some more of this watch.
Sure, yeah.
Well, let me just. I'm happy.
Well, look, I'll just go through a little bit. And just very quickly to some of the stuff that you just said right there, right? So there is obviously, and I don't know why I see this a lot. Look, I'm not against giving the pro-Israeli side of this also. But it just seems like whenever I hear you talk about this, you're ignoring the whole other half of it. Like just talking about how in 1948, these other Arab nations wouldn't agree to recognize Israel. It's like, yeah, but why is that? Like what happened throughout 1947 and 1948? Look, the UN partition, the General Assembly in the United Nations had no authority to create nations. They put a partition recommendation that gave the Zionists 56% of the land and the Palestinians 44% of the land. And this was by no argument fair. There is nobody who could possibly argue that either the Jewish population or the Jewish percentage of land owned justified them getting 56% of the land. But the Jews immediately started violently evicting Palestinians out of their side of the partition. And okay, where in 1948, when the other Arab nations finally invaded, almost none of the fighting was done on the Jewish side of the partition. It was almost all done on the Palestinian side of that partition because the Zionists had already moved well beyond what the UN gave them. And then after that, they took about 78% of the land. And then after 67, they essentially took the rest. Now, your point about Camp David 1, that is, when you're talking about Camp David in the late 1970s, I understand this is and believe me, I'm Jewish. I've grown up around this. I'm so well versed in the pro-Israel point of view here. But it's funny that people always go, look, Israel was happy to give land for peace. And okay, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that they got peace. They've had peace with Egypt and Jordan ever since. And so now to your later point about the idea that the Palestinians have had all of these offers and they always turn it down. I know it makes for a great slogan, but they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, or we have no partner for peace, or a people without land, or a land without people. The problem is all of these slogans are lies. They're not true. And I would highly recommend to everybody listening and to you, sir, personally, because I know you are a reader and you actually know this stuff, read Clayton Swisher's book, the truth about Camp David. This guy went around and spent 3 years interviewing everyone who was a part of those negotiations. And the official story that Arafat just walked away and he had such a good offer, but he wouldn't take it, is not true. And all of the players involved admit this. All right, guys, let's take a moment and thank our sponsor for today's show, which is Sheath Underwear. Go check them out, sheathunderwear.com. The promo code is problemwear.com, promo code problem20 for 20% off your next order. All right, let's get back into the show. Look, Shlomo Ben-Ami, the Israeli foreign minister during the negotiations, said, if I was a Palestinian, I never would have taken the deal we were offering them. That's him. That's their official side of the story. And Yasser Arafat requested another summit and a series of summits afterward, and both the Americans and the Israelis denied them. I mean, look, listen, this was Bill Clinton we're talking about, right? This isn't like, some perfect angel. And all that stuff that we've agreed on with NATO expansion in Europe and how wrong Bill Clinton was for all of that. He also got this one wrong. So I'm not saying you have to completely, reinvent who you define yourself as, but it's just simply, look, believe me, I'm Jewish. I wish the Israeli side of this was just as true as it is, so I could just take that position and I wouldn't have to have all the personal heartaches that I have. The same way everything you've gone through with the positions you've taken that have been very difficult personally and within family, believe me, that's where I am with this position between Israel and Palestine. But the reality is that even if you were right and they offered him everything, even though that doesn't sound right, that they offered him everything and they kept turning it down. That offer, it's not Israel's to give. What right does Israel have to decide whether the Palestinians get their own state or not? It's not their decision to make. They have no claim on this land. The partition plan gave them 56% of the land. They fought a war and they took 80% of the land. And then in 67, they took 100% of it. There is no argument, legal or moral, that Gaza or the West Bank belong to Israel. They shouldn't have to offer them a state of their own. They have no right to deny them one.
Okay, let me just ask you, before I respond to that, let me ask you something. Would you be okay if Israel didn't exist as a Jewish state?
Well, I mean, I don't know exactly what you mean by that. Like, what do you like? If
Hamas overran Israel, which it says it wants to do, and returned it to Palestinian control, is that an outcome that would be acceptable to you?
No, and specifically, what would happen to the Jewish people? Let me put it this way.
Do you think Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state?
Yes.
Okay. I want to clarify that.
Sure.
Would you consider it a very, very bad outcome if Israel ceased to exist as a Jewish state?
Well, hold on. But the reason why it's tough to answer that question is because let's say that they decided we're going to make all of a one-state solution. It's not a Jewish state anymore, but it was, say, a limited constitutional republic where everyone's rights are protected. That I wouldn't have a problem with. So if it just didn't call itself a Jewish state anymore, that I don't really care about. If you're saying if all of the people of Israel were either murdered or forced to leave, yes, of course I'd have a problem with that. In the same way that I can recognize what.
But you, do you support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state?
I think that that's fine. I think that it's worth recognizing in the same way that we would probably recognize that it was not legitimate or just or moral what we did to the Native Americans to create our country. However, it happened. It's many generations ago. People have built a life there for themselves, and we're not about to give the land back to the Native Americans. But we should make damn sure that any Native Americans that are still here have their natural rights protected. So that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying we're not going back to.
Aren't Jews actually the indigenous people of Palestine?
Now, I think that's what
they were there 2,700 years continuously.
Yeah, but no,
they're prototypical indigenous people. I've represented American Indians for 35 years in treaty negotiations and litigation to restore their rights to to traditional lands. And I would say that the Jews are the prototypical indigenous group. They've occupied the same land for 2,700 years, the same language, the same religion, the same culture, the same customs. Don't they have a right to a Jewish state?
First of all, that's not true. The Hebrew was not spoken by any of the original Zionists. They retaught themselves Hebrew because they wanted to go back. These were European settlers. And no, the idea that you can just go back to Ireland tomorrow, Bobby, and kick someone out of their home and say, hey, I'm the true Irishman who was here before all of you. It's ridiculous to say you have some 2,000-year-old supernatural property right.
You believe Palestinians should be able to walk across the border and reclaim their land.
I never said that. I said they get their land. Gaza and the West Bank is theirs. I'm not saying they can go back and reclaim Tel Aviv. I'm saying that Gaza and the West Bank is theirs.
Okay, I just want to know where we disagree. I think we agree on a lot of, listen, David, I think you and I agree on principles. That the issues here are really these clashing for narratives of history. And what I would say to you, and I've looked at this as an attorney, like I look at everything, I break it down into facts. And so let me say a couple of things in response. First of all, the birth certificate for Israel is as good as any nation in the world. The pedigree, it was voted on by the League of Nations. First of all, the Ottoman Empire lost a war. And you lose a war, there are consequences. The Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. The Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations said, okay, here's what we should do with the Ottoman Empire. We should give it to its indigenous people to rule, carve it up, and give each indigenous group their own land to rule. So then the empire is no longer ruling it. Britain was given the Palestinian mandate to partition. Now there are two races in Palestine, and one of them is Jewish, and one of them is Arab. There's actually Christians too, and the Christians were given their own country, which is Lebanon. So that was carved out, and of the Ottoman mandate, Lebanon was given to Christians. Mm-hmm. Jordan, which was 4/5 of Palestine, 4/5 was given to the Palestinians and the Hashemites as a Islamic state, as a officially Muslim state. Israel was created from a tiny, tiny sliver as a officially Jewish state. Israel, by the way, there are 27 states in the region that all have official religions. There's 41 countries in the world that have official religions. There are Muslim countries, there are Buddhist countries, there are Hindu countries, there are Christian countries officially, and those countries all have rules that diminish the rights of minority religions. Israel is one of 28 nations in the Mideast. 27 of those nations have an official religion. Israel's the only country that doesn't.
Yeah, Israel's a Western country, and you're talking about third world countries. Sure,
but total freedom of religion now.
These just seem like talking points. I'm not arguing any of that.
Well, no, because you're saying the state of Israel, you're questioning its existence, and nobody does that.
No, Bobby, I feel like you're prepared to argue with somebody else, and this is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying,
you dragged us into this, David. Come on.
No, I don't have an issue with them being.
You made this foundational assertion, which is that Israel's birth was illegitimate.
No, that's not what I said. What I said was that Israel's birth involved forcibly kicking people out of their homes by the hundreds of thousands. It's a historical fact.
Hey, David, Pakistan was born the same year.
Yes, I grant you. I'm not even making that. Okay, fine.
4 million people moved from Pakistan. 4 million people that moved from India. Oh, and that Greece and Turkey, the same thing happened. Czechoslovakia.
So it's the way of the world. It's horrible, but it's the way of the world. But listen.
Right. And by the way, in November of this year, 176,000 Afghans were expelled from Pakistan. It didn't make a ripple. They were legally there, and they were just suddenly expelled.
It's horrible, but I'm not defending that.
In September, Azerbaijan emptied the Armenian state of Artsakh to 120,000 people. No, not a ripple in the news. The only time people, and by the way, during 1948, when 750,000 people left, Palestinians left Israel. Why did they leave? They left.
Well, many of them left because they had their villages ransacked and people were slaughtered and they were force marched out. And then many others left because they had heard the rumors of what was going on in these other villages. And then some of them left just because a war was breaking out and they wanted to flee and return to their homes later. But do you deny that there was huge numbers of them who were violently evicted?
I think a small number of them were.
Okay.
Let me give you my reasoning for that. Okay. There are no recordings. There's no good historical record of any systematic effort by Israeli officials to expel Arabs from their land. Now,
but there's records of all of the Jewish militias doing it. But this is the Benny Johnson cop-out. There's no official directive. By the way, this is also what Holocaust deniers say about the Holocaust. You can't find the official order. All right,
David,
sorry, go ahead.
Let me finish.
Sure.
There were certain villages like Lodz which were emptied by Haganah, which is, as you point out, a paramilitary group. Most of the best historical records indicate that most of the Arabs left Israel because they were told to by the Arab League nations. Now, because the Arab League nations were invited by the Palestinians to come in, invade, and kill all the Jews, wanted to get the Arabs out of the way so they could commit a genocide. Now, look, this is a quote from the foreign minister at that time, Khalid al-Azzam of Syria, who was part of those nations. Since 1948, he says, we have been demanding the return of the refugees. While it is we who made them leave, we brought destruction upon 1 million Arab refugees by calling on them, pleading with them to leave their lands. We ordered their departure. We have accustomed them now to begging. We have participated in lowering their moral and social level. Then we exploited them in executing crimes of murder, arson, throwing bombs upon men, women, and children, all this in service to political purpose. This is Mahmoud Abbas, who is the current prime minister of the Palestinian Authority. He accused the Arab armies of having abandoned the Palestinians after they, quote, forced them to immigrate, to leave their homeland, and to throw them into prisons and slums similar to those in which the Jews used to live. I can show you hundreds of Arab newspapers ordering the people of Palestine to leave so that the Jews could be exterminated. Now, many Palestinians did not. The ones that did not became citizens of Israel. The ones who left are not citizens of Israel. There are Arab countries around Israel that provoke them to leave, which are 600 times the area of Israel. At the same time, those 8 Arab nations expelled 1 million Jews. 1 million. Right? They ethnically cleansed their populations.
And that's horrible, right?
Those Jews were taken in
and that's
by
wrong.
Israel to this tiny little nation. Israel took them all in.
Yeah, of course, because they want their Jewish supermajority.
The Arab nations who are dealing with their refugee crisis of their creating refuse to take in the Palestinians. So why are we blaming Israel?
Well, I don't know. It seems like, and I don't exactly get this, it seems like you're quite comfortable to say it's horrible when Jews were expelled from Arab nations, but somehow it's not horrible when Jews expel the Arabs. And you can say it's all because other
Hey, David, listen, bad things happen in war. Everything's horrible.
Yeah, but why is it always an excuse? Why isn't it always an excuse? Fine, bad things happen in war. Why do we have to support it? Why does America have to pay for it? Why, can I get one presidential candidate who doesn't want to support a foreign war? Can I get one presidential candidate who will say 6 months without war?
David, you already said that you don't believe that those Palestinians or their offspring have a right to return. You just said that to me. So I didn't say that. I think it would be nice if some of them were allowed to, but I don't think that's really what the battle's over. I think what the battle is over is the occupation since 1967, the blockade of Gaza since 2006, and I think what the battle is really over right now is what Israel is doing to Gaza, absolutely leveling the place, and all the while bragging about how they want to I don't know. They want to move the population. Well, Netanyahu is going, and I know you can say you're a critic of Netanyahu, but you support Israel. But at the same time, it's like the guy is the longest serving prime minister and the current prime minister of the country. So if you're supporting the country, you kind of are supporting, at least to some degree, what he's doing right now. And it is unconscionable. It is the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world right now. And the idea that you, who are supposed to be the anti-neocon, anti-war presidential candidate, are immediately on October 7th, before we even had an investigation, before we even knew what happened there, you immediately say, what basically you said everything they say about Ukraine. You said it was an unprovoked attack, which, like, come on, give me a break. An attack from Gaza against Israel is unprovoked. And then you.
Okay. I've been, we have, as hard as it may be to believe, if you look at the overall time and the time of the debate, there has been a lot more of you and me talking than us watching it. So I've been trying to watch longer stretches at a time, but if they're going to, sounds like they're going to start getting into October 7th stuff. So this is a pretty good time to pause. So there was a few things going on there, but the main thing I heard since the last time we paused was just like surely like a Guinness Book of World Records level, just marathon performance of whataboutism.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, totally. This country is 600 times larger than Gaza, and so why didn't they take the Palestinians in this or that particular instance? Yeah.
Well, yeah, and also look at the ethnic cleansing that happened in Pakistan. Look at the ethnic cleansing, the expulsion of Jews from different Arab countries. And Dave keeps trying to interject with the obvious point, which is like, yes, that's also bad. How is that a defense of the Israelis doing it? That, like, if other people have committed terrible crimes against humanity, that doesn't mean that, like, you're entitled to one or two.
Right. Yeah, totally. Yeah, we could just accept the Israelis into the United States.
Yeah.
And then that would solve the problem.
Well, I mean, honestly, if the United States and a couple of other Western countries had been a little bit more willing to accept Jewish refugees, God knows, right, how all this would have played out in the late 1940s.
Totally. And then he goes off on this thing about how there's 40 officially religious countries in the world, and 27 out of the 28 in the Middle East are officially religious, and those ones are they're officially religious and they repress other religious minorities. And then he says that the only one that's not officially religious is Israel, but he curiously doesn't finish it by saying, like, and they don't repress any religious minorities.
It's so goofy too, because it's like, look,
like, I was gonna ask you this, like, are you familiar with this? Like, who's deciding which countries are
officially religious? I
must be getting no fucking idea. Like, I've not seen this world report.
I mean, I assume that what he means are just countries that, like, have some law designating something as, like, the state church or the state religion.
Oh, totally. But, like, the high court of Israel has said that they are the sovereign state of the Jewish people. Like,
Well, that's the funny thing, right? Because he's saying Israel doesn't have an official religion, but then he said that within, like, I know we paused, so it didn't seem like it, but like I think he said that within like 20 minutes, certainly less than half an hour, of him saying that like the absence of a Palestinian state was Mahmoud Abbas's fault because he wasn't willing to say that Israel had a right to exist as a Jewish nation.
right, and now he's saying that it doesn't.
Yeah, it's like, well, hold on. Like, what does that mean? I mean, like, you could, I mean, it's like, look, that they clearly, I don't really understand how the word official is being used here, because it's like, it's not, I mean, Israel is by no means a theocracy. That's certainly true, right? Like in many ways, right? It's a country that has relatively secular laws, like a lot of Western democracy, in many, many ways, right? You can live in Israel. There are plenty of Israeli Jews who, have never voluntarily set foot in a synagogue, right? And live totally secular lives, and that's fine, right? That's all true. But like, denying that Judaism has a deeply ingrained institutional place in the Israeli state is just craziness. Like, it, like, Judaism is probably more important in the structures of the Israeli nation state than lots of official religions are within like the UK has an official religion, right? They have the Church of England is like the state church. The king is the head of it. There's like all these ways that the state is entangled with it. But like, Christianity doesn't, you can't, one obvious difference between the two cases is that, like, you couldn't convert to the Church of England tomorrow and then as soon as you're baptized and confirmed, just like have a legal right to move to England. Right. Like, so in certain respects, Israel Israel is a state that's linked to religion much more, right, than lots of places that I'm sure RFK would count as officially having official religions.
Sure, and like even the United States is like, sure, it's not officially a Christian country, but like, every president we have, pretty much in my lifetime, I think, after every speech in which they announce some military plan to, strike.
Yeah, God bless America.
Every single time, God bless America. And that's like, and then they go like kill a bunch of people. Like, what's the difference between that and like shouting Allahu Akbar or like,
yeah. Well,
whatever.
no, I mean, I don't think there's a difference between those two. I mean, I will say that, like, institutionally, the United States has, like, I think one of the very few places where American institutions are actually much better than a lot of other Western countries is that institutionally there is much more of a separation of religion and state in the U.S. than there is in like even many Western democracies, which is a good thing. It's a great thing.
I don't create a false equivalency either.
This is why, like, this is, by the way, one of the reasons that it's like so crazy when like Joe Biden says like, without Israel, no Jew anywhere in the world would be safe. It's like, what the fuck? You're the president of the United States of America.
Yeah.
Like, are you saying the Jews aren't safe in America? And it's like, I don't know. I mean, it's like, in fact, it seems to me that, one of the reasons that, people on the Jewish side of my family, for example, right, that's like, that, like, it seems to me that one of the reasons that the United States actually has been a great refuge for, those Jewish people who are allowed in, as we just said, during the Holocaust. It would have been nice if they'd opened up the floodgates, but Jewish people who were allowed in, right, like, could actually have like a level of equality and feeling like it was their country and all that stuff that, would have been impossible in a lot of places, which is a good thing. And to bring it back to the topic, because like RFK kept saying, oh, do you accept the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state? Right. It's like, I don't hold Dave's answer against him here. Honestly, I actually think that like what he said was pretty, was fine. Right. But like, were it me, I would have just said no. Right. Like, I don't accept that. Right. Like, I don't think, I don't think that, I think there's a horrible conflation here, because when people say that, right, when they like what the false dichotomy they're trying to set up is either you don't accept Israel's right to exist in the sense that like you want it to be like militarily conquered and like everybody be forced to leave or something, and that you don't, or you accept its right to exist as a Jewish state. It's like, well, no, I think it should be a state of everybody who lives there. That's how I think all states should be. I mean, like, that's like, as Silver Harlow said in the chat, he was like, yeah, okay, the 27 countries with official religions. You know how many I think there should be? 0.
Yeah.
Like I don't think countries should have official religions. Like that's
I think his point is more like, or the reason that he might say yes or like that's fine is because like, if there is an whatever this means, like officially religious country somewhere, like yes, like ideally I think we would all want for any country to have like equal representation of people, but like we're not gonna like make them change that.
No, but it's like when you say does Israel have a right to? It's like it's like if you say like does Saudi Arabia, and I'm not saying it's the same because as I just said, Israel's in numerous obvious ways a much more secular country, but it's like if you say does Saudi Arabia have a right to exist as an Islamic state, I would say no, right? Like that's that doesn't mean that I want to invade Saudi Arabia to like force them not to be, but like if I'm being consulted for my opinion, right, like the answer is no, right? Like I would be very much in favor of them not being one, right? Like that's I don't even really know what it means to say that they have a right to be one, right? It's like either that means it's morally okay, in which case I just disagree, or like they have a legal right to one in the sense that like I guess I believe that in the sense that I think it would be like bad and illegal to like invade them to make them stop. But like that's like, but you might as well say, oh, does Saudi Arabia have a right to like disenfranchise women? Because I also don't want to invade them to stop them from doing that, right? Like, it's silly. It's a silly way to talk. And the whole thing, like when he keeps bringing up, oh, there's 27 countries that have official religions. Oh, Pakistan, kicked out a lot of Hindus, and when the partition happened, and there were like ethnic Germans who had to leave Czechoslovakia. It's like, yes, right. Everything you've just said is true, but if Dave's not defending any of that, none of it is relevant to the subject, right? Because it's like if he was defending it, that still wouldn't show he was wrong about Israel. It would just mean like, well, he has two views that are inconsistent with each other, but like, he should resolve it in the direction of not defending all that other stuff. But it's like he's also not defending all that other stuff, right? Like, so it's like this is, even though like I do, I think whataboutism is an overused charge. I have an article for Current Affairs from like 2022 called "Is Whataboutism Always a Bad Thing?" where like my argument is like that. Yeah, so you remember what I said, right? That like charges of whataboutism are often used to like stop people from drawing analogies, but like it's often really useful to do these analogies, which I agree with. I still think so, right? But like, but this really is like the bad kind of whataboutism. Like this is like the thing that people are being accused of when they're accused of whataboutism. When you're saying, if I say Israel is Israel engaged in all these human rights violations at different times, and you start bringing up human rights violations somewhere else, it's like, well, hold on. Like that is entirely irrelevant to what we're talking about. Like, except if it's an up or down question. So it's like, oh, would you also condemn these? It's like, yeah, of course.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Is like it's only relevant in as much as it actually supports your position. Because like, yes, we agree it's wrong in all these cases too, right. Now we're like actually getting towards the same page. Like, Iraqi Jews shouldn't have been kicked out of Iraq. Correct. So by the same principle, was it wrong to expel Palestinians? Yeah, exactly. Or Pakistanis or whatever.
Yeah. Pick your poison, right? Whichever, right? It's like, yes, all of these were very bad, and like they're all objectionable.
That's
and,
how this one is. Yeah.
yeah, this is how this one is, right? And we, and it shouldn't have like, yeah, it's also funny. It's like they have, I don't know. I keep thinking about that Native American analogy. It's like, look, if
I didn't know he was actually going to do that, by the way. Like, I was when I said he thought that the
that was very perceptive, yeah. Like, but it's like, yeah, it's like, I don't know. I mean, if there were a bunch of Native Americans, like if some Native American militia started kicking people out of their homes and like burning down cities, I would be against that. That would be wrong, right? Next question, right?
Yeah.
By the way, while we're talking about Native Americans, it's worth noting that like 100 years ago, there was the Indian Citizenship Act, which is essentially the equivalent of a one-state solution, which is all the Native Americans are now U.S. citizens. And so also, if you're going to bring up the Native Americans, like, hey, do you agree that it's good that that like in the United States, both people who are descended from the pre-Columbian inhabitants and people who aren't have equal rights, like are both citizens?
Yeah.
Awesome. Why shouldn't that same principle apply over here?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, all right.
He believes that in that situation, the Palestinians are the Americans, are not the Americans, are like Columbus.
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, that's his argument. Which it's like, yeah, I think it's like, I guess I think two things about that. One of them is that it's like a weird analogy given like what we talked about before, that it's like you kind of need a it doesn't, that's like for that, Native Americans would have to, really get the upper hand for this analogy to start flying, making sense, right? But but also too, I don't really care, right, about that analogy, because it's like, look, I don't believe in blood and soil nationalism. I don't think that any ethnic group has some sort of mystical tie to a piece of land that like, that you should have fewer rights because you aren't part of that ethnic group, right? Like I have I think that like, I think everybody who lives on any given piece of land should have equal rights in that land, and should have like, I don't think anybody should be I don't think, I mean, look, this is not some special radical socialist thing. I mean, this is like the Declaration of Independence, right? I mean, everybody has a right to self-government. Nobody should be ruled by a government that they can't, help to vote out of office. Yeah. And, if you think that, right, then you should think that about Israel, Palestine, and it shouldn't matter like all of this shit about like they were arguing about earlier about like, the people have been living here with the exact same language and customs 2,700 years. And it's like, technically that's kind of true, but it's super misleading, that like, because a very small percentage of Israelis are descended from people who, were living there before. But like, also, so it's like, yes, Dave is correct on the facts there, but also, again, just who gives a shit? Like, I don't care whose ancestors were speaking what language or practicing what customs at one time. That should have no impact on the fact that like, if you're a human being, you should have democratic input into whatever government rules you wherever you happen to live, regardless of whether like your parents were first generation immigrants or, whatever, right? Like none of that should be at all relevant. But in any case, we should wrap up the main show. So if you are a patron, I actually have not, because I was running late writing before the show started, so I have not posted the link to the post game yet, but I'm going to post it right now, and then I will give Matthew a chance to go to the bathroom, smoke a cigarette, whatever, and we'll be back in like 10 minutes or so.
Sounds good.
All right. Sounds good. So yeah, if you are a patron, you should have that link in just a moment. We're going to go to the post game. Again, if if you are not, no time like the present to correct that. Get the post games every Monday and Thursday nights, and access to the Discord server. Sometimes you get early access to things. Most importantly, you get our love and gratitude for keeping the show going. So all the rest of it is just a way of saying thank you. So do consider doing that. But if you are a patron, I'll see you in 10 minutes or so.